Before the first drop touched the earth, before the rivers swelled and the rains fell, there moved a grief in heaven that took shape upon a single breast of light. It had watched the slow undoing of the world, the turning of hearts to cruelty, the altar that had become a stage for power, the laughter of the mighty over the weak. It had watched men barter mercy for spectacle, and it had watched angelic strangers mingle with daughters of men until the land itself shuddered beneath a new, unnatural weight. Where pity remained, it bore the cost of obedience. Stay with this telling to the end, and if the story meets you, help it find others who hunger for such weighty things. If you would hear more like this, subscribe, leave a like, and ring the bell so that these ancient echoes may find a hearing. Your presence keeps these recollections alive. They called him by no single name among men. They who saw him at times called him Sentinel, at times the Watchman. The host that sent him had given one charge as a stone is given weight. Guard the remnant until the covenant is sealed. He came down not as a thunder that casts all aside, but as a hand that holds. His wings were like folded banners of dawn and dusk both, their feathers edged with a light that did not scorch the eyes, but that laid a sternness upon the heart. He bore no banner of war. He bore a restraint harder than any steel. Below, the earth was a place of loud pleasures and lurking terror. The giants, those called Nephilim, the offspring whose existence men spoke of in hushed and furious ways, looked like shadows that had moved from myth into flesh. Some bore names still remembered in small corners of the Levant. Og of Bashan, whose feet could sink 2 men deep in the soil. Others were nameless, towering as cedars, muscles like the roots of mountains. They walked the plains and gazed upon villages as if upon toys. Their mouths spoke of dominion. Their hands took with a tenderness that stung. They demanded worship in the places where altars had once been raised to the Most High. They stamped new pillars of stone and set their faces like kings who had usurped a throne by force. On a stony crescent of shoreline, toward the mountain passes that led to Mount Hermon, there rose the shape of a ship where none had a need for ships. Noah and his sons bent over timbers as a penitent might bend over scripture, slowly, reverently, as if each notch in the wood answered a command. The ark grew under their hands, dovetailed planks, beams that drank the sun and then drew closer like prayer. Noah's eyes were worn but steady. His hands bore the calluses of labor and of waiting. The family around him moved with a quiet trust. They did not need the sound of horn or drum to persuade them that their labor was holy. The building itself was their hymn. Word of the ark carried across the plain as a wind carries a sound, thin at first, then gathering. The giants gathered in assemblies beneath the caves and cliffs. The giants came to the shoreline under the cover of starless cloud, drawn by hunger and by the contempt that feeds a tyrant's heart. Og's shadow eclipsed 3 men at once. They came with a sound like boulders unloosing themselves, and where their hands struck, the earth answered with small colds as if it had never been meant to hold such weight. The angel stepped between them and the ark. The giants laughed. Their voices were the sound of stone grinding stone. "Stand aside, little watcher," Og said, and his teeth flashed like split bone. Stand aside, and let us fill the belly of that thing with our seed. Let us make slaves of those who hide in its ribs. The angel's wings unfolded in a movement that took no breath, but that changed the weather. Light braided along each feather like the trail of a distant comet, but it was a light that did not blind so much as it made witness. The nearest giant reached with a hand that could have taken down a house. The angel's palm met the hand, not with a strike, but as one might place a plank to support a roof. The giant's arm stilled as if held by iron, and the air between them hummed with an authority older than their boasting. "Leave them," the angel said. His voice was a thing heard not only by hearing, but by the bones. The giants did not bend to fear, they bent to rage. They struck at him as men strike at a reed that mocks the sea. The blow that should have rent feather and flesh instead met a resistance that left the giant's arm numb, as if the world itself had hardened beneath the angel's charge. A battle began that was not pure force, but a negotiation of wills. The giants battered at his restraint as they would break a dam. He intercepted, he bore, he redirected. When a giant hurled a slab of rock, the angel threw himself, and the rock splintered without crushing him. When another sought to seize him by his wing, the angel anchored himself to a seam of the earth, and the giant's fingers closed upon emptiness, as if they had grasped smoke. Each motion of the angel was measured, each response was a cost. The watcher's heritage pulsed in the giant's rage. There were murmurs among them of the old power that once moved between heaven and earth, of names whispered by those who had slipped the veils. The book called in some traditions Enoch, the traditions which men later wrote to hold explanations for sins too large for ordinary language, breathed whispers among the giant's memory, of fathers who had fallen, of a mixing that should not have been. The sentinel heard those names and felt the ache of still greater things, not only the violence of bodies, but the corruption of order. No blood need be named to tell of cost. When the angel lifted his wing to shield a cluster of women and children who had come near, a giant's knee struck the earth with the sound of a ruptured drum. The land itself had been rent by such violence before, and now it trembled, like a thing that had been awakened. The angel knew his restraint would not be endless. Commands from above had bound him to preserve, not to expel all evil without limit. Mercy had its margin, judgment had its day. In the midst of the clash, the giant king Og called aloud a curse, and the sound rolled like a bowl of thunder across the moor. He hurled himself at the angel with a fury the mountains could feel. The sentinel met him not with hatred, but with weight, the weight of a choice. He stalled Og with a tether of light that wound about the giant's heart like a halter. Og twisted, and in his twisting he revealed a tenderness for which the plain had no name. Fear thinned his roar for a single heartbeat, a glimpse of the child he had been beneath the monster, perhaps, or of the shattered thing that once was order. All the while, far above, the host of heaven was a quiet drum of resolve. The Most High's decree that the waters would come had been sent like an arrow of mercy and judgment together. The angel who stood at the ark felt that arrow as a coolness at the root of his being. Judgment would come, yet preservation must be secured before the sky released its hand. He understood the calculus of divine sorrow. how the heart that wills salvation could also will necessary destruction. The giants grew desperate. Their blows found purchase. Their numbers were a tide. They moved as if to press the ark under like a thumb upon a vine. It was then that the angel drew a line upon the ground, an invisible cord that thrummed against the souls of men and the claws of beasts. The line was not a spell of power born to domineer, but a boundary of purpose. He held them at bay with it. He threw his body between their onward steps and the ark's threshold, as if his flesh were a dam against an ocean. The struggle gathered into a single night of condensed hours, hours in which the air tasted of wire and old bread, hours in which the people's prayers were the only flames left against a cold vastness. Noah's sons lashed the last of the planks, drove the last pegs. The sentinel felt every nail as if he had hammered it himself. Each strike made a small, bright sound like a proclamation. It was done. It would be kept. If they could break the ark, then the new order would not be born. Their hunger would persist like a rot. He gathered his strength not for triumph, but for delay. He fell upon them with a force that was contained, rapid, precise, a seeding that took away the giant's momentum. Stones that had been hurled bound back in arcs that broke upon the open ground. Trees torn from earth slammed into soft loam that did not break his step. He drove them back not to kill them outright. His charge did not extend to wholesale slaughter of bodies where the decree of preservation had not required it, but to hold them where they would not reach the sealed door. He bound their limbs with cords of light that left no mark save the memory of restraint. He set them like great ropes of seaweed upon the strand. They could not move far, though they raged as whales in traps. All this he did while hearing, like a bell that tolled unseen, the first distant sound of water gathering. It was like a far-off engine, not of men's making, that grew into a hymn of inevitability. Rain began as a cold of sound, then as a smell of iron and stone, then as a touch that made hair cling to skin. The first drops fell upon the giants' faces and turned their snarls into startled animal cries. The angels above did not dance, they kept watch. Then the sky opened as a scroll unrolled. The heavens gathered their stores and let them fall in a long, unwavering decision. Rain came as a cold of sound, then as a smell of iron and stone, then as a touch that made hair cling to skin. The first drops fell upon the giants' faces and turned their snarls into startled animal cries. The angels above did not dance, they kept watch. Then the sky opened as a scroll unrolled. The heavens gathered their stores and let them fall in a long, unwavering decision. Rain came as if a great hand had sifted the sky's salt upon the world. Rivers swelled like beasts at the throat. The plains became a mirror of the sky within days, and the ark rose as if a promise had taken buoyancy. The giants roared at the sky as if to defy its will, and the angel who held them leaned his weight into their restraint. He felt the pull of those bodies as a physical thing, and he felt an inward tearing as well. His obedience required him to watch.
He could not spare the world by preventing the flood. He could only save what had been appointed. To watch the dying of a thing one loved is an inward wound sharper than any blade. When at last the waters covered the hills, and there were only ripples where men once walked, the angel released his hold. Those bodies were broken and sunk, by the water, the instrument of judgment. Their physical forms were at an end. The sentinel did not exult. Sorrow rose in him vast as the sea. He had done what he must. He had delayed their reaching, and had kept the ark afloat until the covenant seed was preserved. Yet he also knew the tiny echoes that would remain, what tradition would later name as wandering spirits, a torment of memory made spirit. In the book called Enoch, men would later write that the Nephilim spirits did not simply vanish with flesh. They became a kind of unrest. That account, held as tradition and not set as law, spoke of a haunting that would follow humanity in years to come.
The angel fate of such things, and he treasured the breath of those preserved aboard the ark as one treasures a lamp saved from a wreck. Inside the ark, the sounds were of mixed things, the lowings of beasts, the muffled footsteps of men, the whisper of a child's throat. Noah's family kept a prayer that did not have words, but that was present in the careful tending of all that had been entrusted to them. The sentinel watched from a mast of cloud, his face turned to the vessel as it rode the waters. He felt the swell beneath him like a mother's hush around a newborn. It was a delicate miracle balanced upon a wide cruelty. When the ark at last found rest upon the loins of Ararat, and the rain abated, the sky cleared in a way that told of both mercy and wound. The water drew back like a hand from a brow, and the smell of damp stone and moss rose up. Noah opened a door and sent forth a dove, and the bird came back with an olive leaf, clenched as if to say that green could still be found. Men have always taken heart at that small sign. Even an angel's sorrow can ease at a green thing. On the mountain the sentinel descended. He came to the ark not as a victor, but as one who carries loss. Noah received him without words, and the men and women of that ark looked in their own ways at the world they had been saved into, scarred, silent, new. They understood that the cost had been counted and paid. The angel stood for a long while upon the threshold, watching the couple whose obedience had saved seeds of life. "You kept them," Noah said at last, and his voice was a psalm that had been worked out of labor and loneliness. There was gratitude lodged like a small coin in his throat. The sentinel could not answer in human sounds. His answer was a presence that bent like a bow. He had kept them. He had delayed what would have broken the ark earlier. His restraint had shapen their preservation. Yet, even as he had done this, the memory of what had gone down with the waters pressed upon him. He had been an instrument of mercy whose use entailed the sight of ruin. In the quiet that followed, the rainbow came, like an artist's gentle stroke across the sky, a sign of covenant, not simply between Maker and man, but between holiness and the remnant it preserves. That arch of light told that the world would be tended again, and that judgment would not be a permanent posture, but a wrought response in a heart that loved. The angel looked upon that bow, and felt within him a loosening of the weight he had carried. Yet the loosening was not a joy unchecked. It was a tempered hope. He knew that memory lingers longer than bodies, and that many shadowed things would follow in the ages to come. Thus he rose, not with triumph, but with the quiet of one released from a vigil. His wings, edged by the last rains, and still tasting salt, opened. He felt the earth breathe beneath him, and he bore the knowledge that though the Nephilim's bodies had been swallowed, their legacy, in some traditions, would take shape as roaming spirits, an extra-biblical memory men later called the Wandering Ones. That tradition served as a warning and as an explanation, not as scripture. And the sentinel kept it as a story of consequence rather than a law to be worshipped. He ascended with a prayer that was not put into words, but into his carrying, that those saved might steward mercy well, and that the scars of the past would teach restraint in the hearts of men. From the mountaintop he looked once more upon the ark, a small ship upon a wide plain of returning land. He laid his hand upon the wind as a benediction, and then he stepped beyond the sight of men. He had defied the giants, not for glory, but because the orders he bore bound him to the preservation of a covenantal hope. The world would carry on, altered and cleansed and still vulnerable. The sentinel's sorrow remained a living thing within him, a witness to the cost of mercy. Below, Noah and his family disembarked into a world that smelled of ash and green. They knelt at an altar and offered the first of what they had preserved. Their hands trembled with a gratitude that was clean and raw, like wood newly carved. The earth accepted the offering, and the sky answered with that arch of light that would be remembered for ages. The watchman turned his face toward the horizon, carrying with him an ache that would teach him patience, and a quiet hope that would teach him tenderness. He had been the hand that held back a flood of ruin for a small and holy purpose. He had defied the giants, not for prowess, but for duty, and his defiance was written in the silence that followed the storm. The long aftermath would tell many tales, of rebuilding, of lineage, of the slow memory of those who had been lost. Men would speak of the giants in tremulous tones and write of them in margins. Some later scribes would set down traditions, tales of the watchers and of spirits that lingered, and those traditions would serve as cautions to hearts that might be tempted to repeat such mixing of orders. The sentinel knew that stories hold power. He also knew that only the covenant's sign could steady the future against the old pride. For a time he remained near, unseen among cloud and cedar, guarding with a watchfulness no longer focused upon immediate blows, but upon the fragile beginnings of a world that must learn new ways. He had been given a sorrow that would not leave him easily. In that sorrow he found the shape of true obedience. He had defied giants, and in that defiance a hidden story fell into the keeping of God, buried for ages, yet not erased, a memory to be read by those who would listen. The hush that now lay over the plain was not an absence of sound, but a new kind of listening. Life would begin again, cautious and bright. Some of the younger ones would wake with the taste of salt on their lips from dreams of drowning. Elders would sit silent and weave words of counsel, taking the weight into their own chests so that the young might grow light. The sentinel watched. He did not descend to fashion fields, nor to teach the ways of seed and plough, for these were the tasks given to men. Yet he kept his vigil near enough that his presence was a pressure like wind at the back of a shoulder. At times his protection voiced itself in small mercies, a sudden change of wind that spared a newborn tent from fire, a cloud that broke and gave rain to a tender plot, a gulled path of earth that kept a herd from straying into treacherous mud. When men dreamed, some dreamed of an unnameable figure who stood by the cedars, and they would wake with a sense of being kept. To a chosen few, in the hush before dawn, he breathed a memory that bent the heart toward caution, the tale of mixing that had borne monstrous seed, so that restraint might root where curiosity risked undoing again. Around the plain, small voices began to gather in song. They were not the grand liturgies of later cities, but they were tuneless and true. Songs to call beasts to pen, songs to mark the turning of oxen, songs to bless bread broken between two hands. These simple liturgies were themselves guardrails. In them, the memory of what had been was folded into daily acts of gratitude and work. The household kept lists of herbs and cures. They sketched the animals that had shared their shelter and marked the colors and calls, teaching the next generation which beasts were to be tended and which to be left wild. Whispers of the past crept along the hills like seedlings. Those who had seen the giants would sit by the hearth and draw with a finger in the ash the great feet and the shadowed crowns. And they would warn, talk too much of union with strange orders, and pride will craft anew the old unrighteousness. In time, such telling became the seedbed of tales that bent into many shapes, some sober, some fanciful, some dutiful, others meant only to frighten children into obedience. The sentinel kept his counsel, that these tales be warnings, not objects of worship. Men wrote in the margins of their records not laws, but cautions. Caution against exaltation, caution against taking as play what had once been terror. It was not long before the plain found the patterns of family life. There were births that were celebrated with the same trembling gratitude as a saved child. There were deaths laid beneath mounds of earth and stones, spoken of with prayer and with the memory that the earth does receive its own. They took to naming sons for the courage of those who had preserved them, and daughters for the gentleness that had kept them fed. Generations would rise from these names, and with generations would come the widening of lines, marriages begun, wanderings begun, small quarrels that age would smooth. The face of the land changed with their hands. Hedges grew, paths were worn, and the first engravings of culture were made in the quiet things of daily life. Yet the sentinel's sorrow did not ease to the point of forgetfulness. He bore the memory like a scar that is not fated to be a burden for its own sake, but for the lesson it teaches. He watched not to reap glory, but to be a witness to the covenant's living fruit. When he saw arrogance creep into the talk of men, when they boasted of feats born from cunning rather than toil, his vigilance tightened. He understood that the victory of that day was not in the absence of danger, but in the long maintenance of humility. He prayed in the only way an instrument of heaven may pray, by leaning his will toward restraint, and by holding human hearts within the sight of one who measures mercy. As seasons folded into each other, men who had been children under Noah's roof found themselves fathers with sons who listened more to the sound of plowshare than to the cautionary tales. They remembered the bow in the heavens, and sometimes for years they kept that memory bright. Yet memory will fray where not bound, and the sentinel knew that constancy must be taught as much as it must be remembered. So he continued his quiet attendance on the threshold, not to command, but to guard, not to instruct, but to witness the small, steady acts that form character. He lingered at the rim of cloud and cedar, at times unseen, and at times presenting as a breeze that cooled brows laboring under the sun. And in the hush between one storm and another, when the plain lay clean and the newly planted barley sent a green hush over the earth, the sentinel took one more look upon what had been given to steward. He saw Noah's children teach their children, saw the first wells corked and the first granaries rise, saw laughter threaded with grief and labor braided with song. He felt in that watching a peace tempered by watchfulness, an acceptance that he had done the task set before him, and that the remainder belonged to a chain of care that wound through human hands and into the heart of God. Thus he turned his face from the plain and lifted into the great currents beyond the sight of men, not as one who abandons, but as one who entrusts. Where once his burden had lain heavy, there remained now a quiet that held steadiness. The covenant's bow arched over sky and field, a sign to stead the heart. And though many ages would fold, and the memory of giants would alter in telling, the sentinel carried with him the recollection that mercy has a price, that obedience lays hold not of glory but of service, and that some watches must be kept in sorrow, so that grace may find room to grow. The earth breathed then, deep and slow, and life began to unspool its long patience over the plain. Men and beasts and birds resumed their ancient accord. The ark, weathered and holy, stood as a low monument to endurance. This sentinel, his task done in the way it had been assigned, moved on. Yet the hush he left behind was not emptiness, but a new way of listening, a readiness in the world to receive again the lessons of restraint and the stubborn work of covenantal mercy. In the seasons that followed, the plain showed its patience, as if it had nothing to prove. The houses that rose were low and dark at first, carved from the same trunks that sheltered their first nights. Smoke kept to a slow, steady wind, and the women who tended the children braided hair and grief into the same knots. The barley ripened in rhythms older than speech, and the river learned again to carry small boats of skin and reed. Where hands met earth, songs were made, short, strict refrains that taught the days and measured the work. They sang of seed and rain, of bread and bone, of the cautionary things that had kept their fathers alive. Stories passed as bread does, broken, shared, softened. Some were told by hearthlight as a thing to keep away fancied terrors. Others were spoken beneath the sky, where the bow had once shown itself, spoken with the tremor of gratitude that had the size of prayer. Yet not all ears listened alike. Children who find wonder in the immediate learned first to name the new birds and the new sprouts. The stern particulars of covenant blurred into the background of living. Memory, when not tended by ritual, will find 1,000 ways to slough into story and then into mere sound. In one such household there lived a man whose hands had the long tremor of toil, and the patience of one who had watched a plowshare learn the soil. His name was Avidan, and he kept the quiet of the fields like a thing he had taken into his chest. He was neither the eldest nor the boldest. He was one who noticed details others passed by. The way a child's laugh would hit the rim of a pot, the small mark a falcon left on a post when it nested, the way grass took a different silver in a certain wind. He listened to the elders and stored their phrases as if he were saving kindling against a night he did not yet see. Avidan had a daughter, Miriel, who learned to count knots in rope before she could count goats. She had eyes like river stones and a curiosity that unsettled neighborly order. When the elders told of the drowning and the ark and the bow that bent the heavens, Miriel stood very quiet, as if counting the syllables doubled in the air. She would ask blunt, small questions that made the old men cough on their courtesies. "Will the sky ever cease to be mercy?" she asked once, and it was not a childish fear, but a true weighing. The question rested in Avidan's hands until he could no longer hold it listless. He fashioned for her out of a peeled yew a small toy, a bow that could not shoot, but would remind. Such things kept memory alive. A toy, a phrase, the hanging of a carved bow over a lintel. Households adopted small practices. On the day the elders said they would hear those in favor of the monument, the village smelled of newly turned earth and of the fat smoke that comes when sheep are being skinned for a feast. Voices gathered by the gate, and small children were bidden away. Their laughter threaded the open air between the adult words. Avidan came with Miriel, who had tied her small wooden bow upon her breast with a leather strap and moved like a small ruler in training. The elders sat upon low stones. Those who had designs on glory stood that day with hands clear of soil, their sleeves free of dust. They spoke long. One argued that a monument would bind the people together, that a visible sign would teach those who came after not to wander. Another said that labor poured into lasting things would provide work and order. A third, quieter, feared that anything made to uplift a name might also block the ease with which mercy comes. He remembered, he said, how quickly a small well could dry when a man clung to what it offered. The debate thinned into faces and then into individual pleas. At last, the elders invited any who would speak in reply. Avidan rose with Miriel pulling at his sleeve. He had not planned to speak. Words are not a plow and can fail a good hand. Yet there is a weight that will press a man to his feet when the future seems to favor vanity over steadiness. He stood before the circle of elders with his daughter's carved bow at his breast. In the hush that followed, there were a few coughs and the distant bleat of a goat. "What is a monument?" he began, his voice low and slow, "if it takes the place of remembering?" He did not accuse with sharpness, rather he set a simple test before them. If the stone rises and the hearts forget the making of it, what then keeps us from the same pride that once built out of fear a wooden house to hold the world? If we put our name in rock, do we not risk forgetting the names our hands keep? Will the stone bind us to humility or bind us to show? There were murmurs. One of the men who had championed the monument frowned and spoke of posterity and security. A younger man, swelling to speak of his line, pressed that a marker would be a place for their children to find proof of a father's worth. Muriel, who had been silent as a reed until then, tugged at Avidam's cloak and held up her toy bow. "My bow is small," she said, with a child's clear logic, "and it breaks if used to shoot. But it sits where we pass. I know when to bend to the field because I touch it. If you make a thing to last, who will touch it each morning? Who will remember to teach mercy?" The question rippled through the gathered men with the odd shame of being simple yet cutting. A voice from the back, old as smoke, with a throat that remembered many winters, reminded them that signs were necessary, but that signs could also become thrones. Other voices rose, half in defense, half in new thought.